The idea of a handheld that plays PC games has been around for a long time. Anybody remember the Smock Zero or Smock Z? It was years ago that it was first announced, and it went through all of these development updates over the years, was supposed to be at some game shows and had pre-orders open up. But are we really ever gonna get it? It was supposed to fill up a space, and the development time left that window open for Gamepad Digital to swoop in with the GPD Win about 3 or 4 years ago. Instead of just being a handheld console that could play PC games, it was an actual legitimate laptop that had a gamepad built into it. The original Win was competent at what it was trying to do. It was pretty much the first handheld PC like it, and it could run games like Skyrim okay. But that was 3 years ago. Now they've got a new handheld with an i5, 16GB of RAM, and pretty good performance for a lot of newer games. Here is my review of the GPD Win MAX. First, let's go into the design. As you can see here, it has a full keyboard setup outside of a number pad with a full row of numbers and F keys above it, though the smaller size of the number and F keys do lead to some awkwardness, which I'll get into a bit later. Above the keyboard is the most important part, the built-in gamepad. We've got 2 analogs that can click for the L3 and R3 triggers, a D-pad, 4 face buttons, and we've got a touchpad in the middle for mouse movements. Very small, but if you notice, just above and to the left of the touchpad, we've got 3 buttons for start, select, and menu, which is basically like the Xbox or PlayStation button. And the final piece of the gamepad puzzle is right behind the hinge for the screen. Right back here, we've got 4 triggers for the L and R buttons set up in the same kind of style and design as on the Nintendo Switch. Though this does have 2 modes that you can go into, as not all PC games are compatible with a gamepad. On the left-hand side of the device, you have a little switch that can switch between gamepad mode and mouse mode. When you go into mouse mode, the left and right analog sticks change what they do. The right stick moves the mouse cursor around on the screen, and the left stick becomes for directional movement and serves as the W, A, S, and D keys. You can also use the triggers to enhance the mouse. L and R being left click and right click, and R2 allowing you to move the mouse cursor faster. As far as ports go, on the back right past all of the fan vents, we've got 2 USB-C ports, 2 USB 3.0 ports, and a fully sized HDMI port, which made recording for this review incredibly easy. And then we go on to the right side where we've got a slot for a micro SD card, as well as a fully sized Ethernet jack if you want to hardwire the connection. The final ports that we have are right under the arrow keys on the very bottom front of the device, which is an auxiliary port for headphones and a tiny little microphone receiver. The bottom doesn't have much on it, and if you look right here where I'm pointing, these are the game's speakers for the audio. I do have some words to say about that, but we'll get into that later. Next, let's talk about the system's specs. We've got an i5 8 CPU processor, 16GB of RAM, Intel Iris Plus graphics, along with 8GB of shared memory. And as far as how much space you have to store stuff, it's definitely not as much as I'd like. We've got 2 internal drives. The C drive fits about 100 gigs and the D drive fits about 364. I say this isn't optimal because if you've seen a lot of PC games, especially newer games, there are tons of them that range from 60 up to 100 gigabytes apiece. I'm looking at you, Forza 7. Speaking of Forza, let's talk about games and the performance I got out of them. Last week and this week, pretty much every moment that I wasn't working and was home was spent downloading and testing games for performance. And before I get into the actual performance test, I want to clarify something I found out just a few days ago. When I did my initial testing, I tried the Resident Evil 2 Remake's demo and it would never boot for me, giving me errors. When I bought the full game, it ran just fine. Now, I've tested about 31 games on the Win MAX across the Steam, Epic Game Store, and Blizzard applications. Games that had a bit of age play pretty well. Games like GTA 5, Fallout 4, Halo the Master Chief Collection, and Forza 7 all run pretty much 40 to 60 frames per second depending on what settings you're using. And when we get to newer games, it's a bit lower but still pretty acceptable. For example, Fallout 76 normally ranges about 25 to 35 FPS on low settings, and Overwatch stayed above 30 as long as I didn't use high settings. Though I will admit the control and speaker placement isn't super optimal. The small analog sticks take a while to get used to and are pretty difficult to use at first with fast-paced shooters like Overwatch. You can adjust them as I have over the past week and a half, but it takes a bit of effort. And while a bit minor, the small size of the menu start and select buttons makes it a little bit difficult to hit what you want. Because of their location and size, it's very easy to try to hit the start button and accidentally hit the menu button, which pulls up the Xbox dashboard. But what is not that minor is the speaker placement. Considering the speakers are on the very bottom of the device and you'll typically be holding it up like a handheld, a lot of the sound will be moving away from you instead of towards you. Now, when I move my palms down over the speakers, it bounces off and comes back at me and sounds pretty good. But even my larger hands cannot use the gamepad when they're down that low, and when you have it setting down on a table, it's also not really going to be projected at you very well. Okay, that's all I have to say about gaming, so let's very quickly talk about general use. I wanted to play this not just as a game device, but as an everything device. How did I do that? Well, I installed every program I use on my Surface Book 3, and this review that you're watching was made on the GPD Win MAX. And let me tell you, looking at the capture card software, recording itself on the screen really messes with you. So as far as using this as a normal computer, the memory isn't a bad situation. I did have Audacity freeze up on me once when the battery was low, but outside of that, it ran most of my software without any problems. The big problem or awkwardness comes when you're typing on the keyboard. Every time I would just be smoothly typing something and would have to add a number, I'd have to stop and kind of go into hunt and peck mode to very carefully put those numbers in. One other thing I should mention is the resolution. The maximum resolution that you can put the display on is 1280 by 800. It can't go any larger than that, so if you're big on resolution, that's something to keep in mind. And before taking too much time here, let's go into the power and battery situation. The first thing I'll say is that this fan came from the Dragon Ball Z universe. It is a screamer. It'll go off when you're doing a lot of things that may not necessarily be using a lot of memory. I've had times where I've just connected to Wi-Fi and opened Google Chrome and the fan started screaming at me for about 20 seconds before calming down. Needless to say, you should expect it to constantly go whenever you're playing a game. And now let's go into battery life, making this sound a little bit like my Switch reviews. Now, just to make things clear, I did not go into the BIOS to do anything. You can, and there's even instructions in the quick start guide that's built into the desktop upon first boot, but I messed with a lot of overclocking and voltage settings on my original GPD Win, and that unit ended up dying. So to make sure that didn't happen here, I didn't mess with it at all, but it's worth noting that you can go in and change the voltage, which will increase the battery life. So when you've got a heavy game playing like Halo the Master Chief Collection or Fallout 76, you're not going to get that much battery life out of it. Even if you put it on best performance mode, you're only going to get about 2 to 4 hours total. Now, if you're not playing a game and are just using it as a normal computer to watch YouTube videos or type something up in a word processor, on your normal battery settings, you're going to get about 4 to 5 hours out of it, and on best performance mode, you'll get about 8 to 10. It's also worth noting that less graphically intense games like visual novels will pretty much keep the battery life as it would be if you were just normally using the computer. And I don't really have anything else to say about it, but if you're wondering about the price of this, it's going for about $700 to $800 on GPD's website, whereas a certain user on Amazon is charging about $1,000 for pre-orders. Now, in conclusion, GPD had some mild success when they launched the Win back a few years ago, but they've done some impressive work with the Win MAX. While there are some design annoyances with key placement and small analogs along with the pretty meager battery life for intense games. But for the performance you're getting, it isn't a bad price, and the specs allow for productivity applications as well. Reviews to go rates the GPD Win MAX an 8.5 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thanks for watching and have a great day.